Hundreds of strange moss-covered balls lined the bottom of a river, packed tight against the city's water intake valves. When a team of treasure hunters cut one open, what they found inside triggered an FBI investigation and led to 20 arrests across the state. Make sure to subscribe so that you won't miss any new stories. Jess Hunt had been diving for scrap metal and lost valuables in urban waterways for 6 years. It paid better than most people assumed. Old copper fittings, dropped jewelry, sometimes even outboard motors that had slipped off dock mounts. She and her dive partner, Ben Spalding, had turned it into a legitimate salvage business operating out of a rented warehouse on the east side of Portland. They worked rivers, reservoirs, and harbor channels, usually pulling in enough to cover expenses and then some. It wasn't glamorous, but they knew the water better than almost anyone in the region. The job that changed everything came through a routine permit. The city had approved them to dive a stretch of the Willamette River near the municipal aqueduct, an area that had been off limits for years due to ongoing infrastructure work. Construction had wrapped up 2 months earlier, and the waterway was finally open to civilian divers again. Jess figured the construction crews had probably knocked plenty of metal debris into the river. Easy pickings. They launched the boat on a Thursday morning in early March. The sky was flat gray, and the river had that heavy metallic smell it always carried in the colder months. Visibility underwater was maybe 4 feet on a good day. Ben ran the sonar and handheld metal detector from topside, while Jess handled the diving. They had a system. Ben would mark coordinates, Jess would drop, locate, and tag whatever was down there. If it was worth pulling, she'd rig it to the winch line and Ben would haul it up. For the first 2 hours, everything was routine. Jess pulled up a rusted valve cover, a length of rebar, and what looked like half a shopping cart frame, standard urban river debris. She was getting ready to move the boat downstream to a new grid when Ben told her to hold. The detector had gone haywire. Ben called down to Jess over the comm. The signal wasn't a single hit. It was a continuous wall of pings, concentrated in a band about 60 feet wide, running parallel to the aqueduct's intake structure. Jess swam toward the coordinates and dropped to the riverbed. What she saw through her mask made her stop kicking entirely. The bottom was covered in spheres, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, each one roughly the size of a softball. They were coated in a thick layer of green moss and river algae, which made them look almost like natural formations. But they weren't scattered randomly the way debris would be. They were arranged in tight rows, almost grid-like, concentrated heaviest directly in front of the 3 massive intake pipes that fed the city's water treatment system. Jess picked one. Up bull, it was heavy, much heavier than a rock that size should be. She squeezed it through her glove and felt something dense and rigid underneath the moss layer. She loaded as many as she could into a mesh collection bag and signaled Ben to pull her up. When they hauled the net onto the deck, something unexpected happened. The balls began leaking. A dark, syrupy fluid oozed out where the mesh had scraped away patches of moss. It smelled sharp, chemical. Nothing like the organic rot you'd expect from something that had been sitting on a riverbed. The fluid stained the deck in streaks that wouldn't wash off with river water. Ben wanted to crack one open right there. Jess told him no. Whatever these things were, someone had placed them deliberately. That grid pattern wasn't natural, neither was the fluid. She had a contact at Portland State who owed her a favor. They loaded the boat and drove straight to campus. Dr. Alan Claxton ran the Environmental Sciences Lab on the 3rd floor of the university's research building. He was in his late 50s, methodical, the kind of researcher who measured everything twice and trusted nothing at face value. He had worked with Jess before on a contamination case involving industrial runoff near the Columbia River, which was why she had his number. When Jess and Ben walked into his lab carrying a plastic bin full of dripping green spheres, he looked more annoyed than curious. He had a grant proposal due that week and wasn't interested in cataloging river junk. That changed the moment he picked one up. Claxton weighed the sphere on a precision scale. The density reading made him pause. It was far too high for calcium deposits, river concretions, or any natural mineral formation he had encountered in 30 years of fieldwork. He turned the ball slowly under the overhead light, examining the moss layer. It was real moss, genuinely river-grown, but it had colonized the surface in a way that suggested the object had been in the water for at least several months. He photographed the grid-like arrangement from images Jess had captured on her underwater camera and noted the proximity to the intake valves. Then he rolled one of the spheres into the X-ray machine at the end of the lab. The image that came up on the monitor made Claxton push his chair back from the desk. The interior of the ball was not hollow. It was packed solid with dense, calcified clusters arranged in concentric layers. Thousands of tiny organisms fused together into a single mass, wrapped around a core that appeared to contain some kind of synthetic material. This was not geology. This was biology. Engineered biology. Claxton picked up a scalpel and made a careful incision along the equator of the sphere. The outer shell cracked apart easier than expected. Inside, the clusters were wet, alive, and unmistakable. Zebra mussels. Thousands of them, compressed and cultivated into a tight ball, layered around a slow-dissolving nutrient pellet at the center. Claxton set down the scalpel and stared at the dissected sphere for a long time. Then he walked to his office, closed the door, and called the FBI field office in Portland. His voice was steady, but the message was urgent. Someone had manufactured biological weapons designed to destroy the city's water infrastructure. Within 48 hours, the scope of the investigation had expanded far beyond Jess and Ben's dive site. Federal agents coordinated with the city's Department of Water Management to shut down the aqueduct intake temporarily. Divers from the Army Corps of Engineers recovered over 340 spheres from the riverbed. Each one was identical in construction, each one packed with invasive zebra mussels bred to multiply and clog the filtration system from the inside out. The engineering behind the spheres was disturbingly sophisticated. The outer moss layer served as natural camouflage, making the balls indistinguishable from river roxon. Sonar. The nutrient core was designed to dissolve over a period of roughly 6 months, slowly feeding and expanding the mussel colony. Once the mussels matured, they would detach from the spheres and latch onto the intake pipes, breeding exponentially until the entire filtration system seized up. The city would have faced a complete water infrastructure failure within a year, maybe less. The break in the case came not from the river, but from a supply chain. FBI forensic chemists analyzed the nutrient paste inside the cores and matched its chemical signature to a restricted agricultural compound. The compound was a specialized muscle growth accelerant, not commercially available, produced in small batches by a single biotech supplier in Eugene, Oregon. Purchase records showed that the entire stock of that specific batch had been bought 18 months earlier by a company called Clearflow Dynamics. Clearflow was a mid-sized water treatment firm based out of Salem. They sold proprietary filtration systems to municipalities across the Pacific Northwest. On paper, they were a legitimate infrastructure company, but investigators quickly noticed a pattern. In every city where Clearflow had won a major filtration contract in the past 5 years, the existing water system had suffered an unexplained failure in the months leading up to the deal. Clogged pipes, contaminated intakes, equipment breakdowns that conveniently require the exact technology Clearflow happened to sell. Agents obtained warrants for Clearflow's offices, warehouses, and the personal residences of its executives. The raid on their Salem headquarters happened at 6 a.m. on a Tuesday. Employees arriving for work found the parking lot filled with federal vehicles. Filing cabinets were seized. Servers were imaged on site. What investigators pulled from those systems confirmed the worst. Internal emails, project timelines, and encrypted spreadsheets detailed a systematic campaign to sabotage municipal water systems and then swoop in with expensive replacement contracts. The Portland operation, codenamed Green Line in their files, was the most ambitious yet, targeting a system that served over 600,000 residents. A separate warrant hit a rented warehouse outside Corvallis. Inside, agents found a climate-controlled breeding facility, rows of tanks filled with zebra mussel colonies, workbenches stained with the same dark nutrient paste found inside the river spheres, molds used to shape the balls, packaging materials, the entire production line, hidden in a nondescript industrial unit between a furniture storage company and an auto parts distributor. The company's lead engineer, a marine biologist named Dr. Renee Okafor, had designed the spheres. She had been recruited from an aquaculture research lab 3 years earlier with the promise of groundbreaking conservation work. Instead, she had been tasked with weaponizing invasive species. When agents arrived at her apartment in Portland, she answered the door before they could knock. She had been expecting them. Okafor cooperated fully once confronted with the evidence. She provided detailed accounts of 7 separate sabotage operations across Oregon and Washington, each designed to look like natural infrastructure decay. Over the next 3 weeks, federal and state agents executed coordinated raids across the region. 20 individuals were arrested on charges ranging from environmental terrorism to fraud and conspiracy. The net included Clearflow executives, field operatives who had planted the spheres, and 2 former city officials in smaller Oregon towns who had accepted kickbacks in exchange for steering emergency contracts to the firm. Clearflow's CEO, a man named Garrett Lind, was the last to be taken into custody. Agents found him at a private airfield outside Medford, sitting in a chartered plane that had already been cleared for takeoff to Vancouver. He didn't resist. The municipal aqueduct was offline for 11 days while Army Corps divers cleared every remaining sphere from the riverbed. Engineers inspected the intake pipes inch by inch and found early-stage mussel colonies already forming on the interior walls. Small clusters, no bigger than a fist, but growing. If the spheres had gone undiscovered for another 2 or 3 months, the colonization would have reached a tipping point. The entire intake system would have required a complete replacement, a project estimated at over $90 million, exactly the kind of crisis Clearflow had been engineering for years. Jess and Ben were interviewed by half a dozen agencies and eventually received a formal commendation from the city. The salvage business picked up after that. New clients, better permits, a few news segments. But Jess never took another job near a municipal water structure. She told Ben once that the thing that stuck with her wasn't the investigation or the arrests. It was the moment on the boat when those balls started leaking onto the deck, how something could look so natural on the outside and be so precisely engineered to cause destruction on the inside. She said it made her think differently about everything she pulled off the bottom. Not everything that looks like it belongs there actually does.